Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I'm glad you're here. You've just tuned into one of the most important podcasts that you may ever listen to, because the purpose of this podcast is to provide a safe space for victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault to share their stories and connect with others who've been through similar experiences. However, there are other important aspects to this podcast: community, education, and support. I believe that sharing our stories is one of the most important steps to healing, and my hope is that the SAS podcast will help victims and survivors feel less alone and more empowered. And my ultimate goal is to provide all of my listeners with insights, resources, and a supportive space where empathy, compassion, and understanding thrive. My commitment is to being there for all my listeners. I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and I'm here each week talking to victims and survivors or interviewing experts and professionals in order to not only gain insights and information to help us on our healing path, but also to provide an education on being trauma-informed, working to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Whether you're aware of it or not, we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. So I encourage everyone to listen to this podcast. Whatever your experience is with rape or sexual assault, you are not alone, and we are all here for each other. Thank you again for being here. Hi, SAS listeners. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. This is episode 92. A few months ago, I was privileged to be a guest on the Jan Broberg Show and to be interviewed by Jan. She has generously allowed me to air this episode on my show. I wanted to do this so that you could hear my own survival story of sexual assault, both as a child and as an adult on more than one occasion. Another critically important aspect of this interview is the fact that Jan asked me about the importance of being trauma-informed. It gave me the perfect opportunity to describe some of the more important details of the neuroscience of trauma and memory in sexual assault. And it brings trauma-informed insight and knowledge that everyone can use in everyday relationships and situations. I hope you have a greater understanding of the impact of rape and sexual assault after you hear this interview. Here's Jan interviewing me.
I am very excited to welcome back to the studio one of my favorite people on the planet, Dave Markel. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Jan. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, it always is so enlightening and such an amazing conversation when I have the opportunity to sit down with you and talk about the subject at hand. Now, Dave, as many of you might know, because you've listened to the podcast, or maybe you're a member of our online community, Thrivivors, Dave is really an expert. And so introducing him and all the specialties that he has dealt with in his career really give him credence as to why he's such an important guest on our show today. He started his career as a cop and a detective, and for 18 years, he was in law enforcement, and 15 of those years he spent as a family crimes detective, where he dealt with rape, child rape, domestic violence, child abuse, and was the case lead investigator. So he has a really huge knowledge. And what was interesting is that he started to get the attention of the Army Criminal Investigation Division, and he ended up teaching for 6 years for the U.S. Army as a highly qualified expert, an HQE, and served in CONUS, Europe, and South Korea. He is the owner and director of Markel Consulting, LLC, and has his own podcast called Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, where he interviews those who have survived sexual assault like myself and others, and is doing a great service as he goes and teaches from the trauma-informed perspective. Not only did he do that for 6 years for the U.S. Government Army, but he has done it for many others. In fact, he just got back from Bowling Green, you said, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
How was that, Dave?
it was an amazing experience. It was just a one-day class, which is kind of hard because there's so much material to kind of squeeze into 7.5 or 8 hours. I always end up leaving parts out that I wish I didn't have to. But yeah, it went great great response, and I appreciate those people in Bowling Green. It was the Barron River Area Child Advocacy Center that sponsored the training. They do an annual multidisciplinary team training. And so I was brought in for that, but it ended up being an invite to multidisciplinary participants in that general community area all over. And we ended up with about 85 people. It started out with just about 15 or 20 and ended up with 85 that registered. It was great.
And many different disciplines. So an advocacy group usually has, or an advocacy center has representation or whatever from a lot of different disciplines. Can you tell us which ones were represented there?
Well, the advocacy center itself for children, child advocacy center, but there were advocates from law enforcement, victim advocates, and there were police officers and investigators, and there were prosecutors, social services therapists, mental health therapists, SANEs, sex assault nurse examiners, and mm, various people like that. It's just a wide variety of participants. And what I teach is that this isn't just applicable for people who are doing interviews or even adult sex assault interviews, but it's relevant information for everyone to use. It's a good way of just knowing how the brain works and how productive a normal conversation can be if you're trauma informed and know how to ask the right questions in the right ways. So it can help in interpersonal relationships, um, significant others, but it can help with your own children. It's just a really phenomenal, strong way of communicating in a empathic and trauma-informed way.
Well, I think there is something to be said for that because the interpersonal relationships of sexual assault survivors can often be so challenging for us. And, I think that with all of your expertise and your professional side, I think it's important to note that you're also a survivor. You're a survivor of both childhood sexual assault and adult sexual assault.
Correct.
And as a human being, I had the opportunity of meeting Dave through a theater experience. And so I've known Dave for 18 years now, and he has, amazing talents and gifts. He has a beautiful voice. He's an actor, and he does that for enjoyment mostly, but you really could have been a professional singer, Dave.
Right.
I love this side of Dave too. So the thing that I love about you, Dave, is that you are so well-rounded with all of these experiences that you've had, that you make such sense out of nonsense and what we've been through. And so because that's our program, is to, find our healing path or to move forward in our relationships, be able to maneuver what we have experienced and been through. You're a great example. And you also, um, as a survivor who I have not really interviewed in that, from that really line of focus, I'm just wondering, would you mind telling us a little bit about what happened, to you and how that maybe led you into what you do today?
Absolutely. I really didn't think of what happened to me between my mom and I as being sexual assault until I became a police officer. In fact, I didn't have any emotional trauma per se. I know I did, but I didn't recognize it as personal trauma from those experiences. But it definitely shaped my security versus insecurity in who I was close to and who I wasn't. And I'm sure it impacted my personal life in my relationships with my former spouse and even my current spouse. But what happened was I was exposed to my mom showing an inordinate amount of affection to me, and it became sexual in nature at several times in my young life. I think I remember episodes of sexual contact as early as 3 and 4 years old. And I remember that eventually stopped, probably because of my age and the fact that I could become more verbal about what was going on. But I also think she probably saw me becoming more touchy-feely, affectionate in inappropriate ways with other adult grown women from our church and from social interactions and things where I would try to snuggle in and nuzzle with adult women. And because that's a lot of what it was with my mom, with her just coming out of the bath or a shower and calling me into the room, and then lots of hugging and touching and things along those lines. That, like I said, growing up, I just thought I was being loved, thought it was affection, not recognizing the impact of what that was having on myself personally. Um, it eventually had an impact on my relationship with my mom, probably not until after high school when I got into college. And that's where my next sexual assault happened, was in college. And it was not anywhere similar to what I had experienced with my mom. In fact, it was quite the opposite. The first time it happened away from my family situation was I was at a university in Texas. I was visiting a friend in his dorm room. We were going to go to dinner together. He had like 30, 40 minutes more worth of studying that he had asked if I would indulge him in. And I said, sure, I'll just lay here on your dorm floor and listen to music. So I put on some headphones and was listening to music. And another friend of his happened to see me lying there. The door of the dorm room was open, and this other friend of his walked by. And I believe there was this element of jealousy that my friend had me as a friend, and this other guy that was walking by saw that I was in there, and he happened to be just finishing drinking a Pepsi, and back then, all the soft drinks were in bottles, but he took that bottle as I was laying face down, just kinda laying on the floor, and he shoved it into my anal area. It was fully dressed, but he shoved it into my anal area in with such force that I was in immediate severe pain, and I went into the freeze mode. I went into tonic immobility. I had absolutely no idea who was doing that, why they were doing that, what was really happening. I just know it hurt. And he started laughing, and I think I laid there for probably a minute while he was having a conversation with our mutual friend there in the dorm. And I finally was able to turn over and see who it was. And he swore at me, said a few words, and ordered me not to tell anybody ever what he had just done, or there would be worse. So that was an extremely painful sexual assault experience, in the sense that not only emotionally was I impacted, but also physically. I couldn't sit comfortably, seriously, for about 2 weeks. It was in such pain. And I didn't tell anybody. Barry saw it happen, my friend that was in the room, the dorm room, whose dorm room we were in, but nobody else saw that. And I certainly was not going to tell anybody, not only because the person who did it, his name was Mitch. Mitch, Mitch told me not to tell anybody, but I don't think I would have told anybody without that admonition. I just was embarrassed and also scared of what he might do in retaliation if I did tell anybody. But mostly I was just embarrassed and shamed for something I didn't even do. But it was an extremely intrusive, painful interpersonal reaction that I had with him. And I really can relate to other victims and survivors who say that I just couldn't tell anybody because I was in that same boat for years. I think several years later, when I was working in California, I took a job at an office supply company. Had moved out of my home in El Paso after my Baylor experience and went to California to try and get into school there. And I took a job at an office supply store, which is what I had grown up with because my dad was a manager and then an owner of a mom and pop type office supply store. And so I was working at this facility, and my immediate supervisor was the manager of shipping and receiving. And I was an order puller. Was up on some shelves just pulling some orders that were going to get delivered, office supplies. And I was straddling probably about 8 to 10 feet up off the ground. I was straddling two shelves, and I started to come down, and my supervisor walked between my legs and started fondling me through my clothing. And he thought that was hilarious, and I thought it was embarrassing and told him to stop and never do that again, but it happened probably 4 or 5 more times. All of that to say that I think that shaped some of why I went into law enforcement. I felt bullied and taken advantage of, and I kind of looked at law enforcement as a way to help others who might be in that same situation. I know, and I've talked about this before, that I know some police officers take that bullied experience and victimization and turn it into a retaliatory opportunity as a police officer. So I'm wearing the badge now. Nobody's going to hurt me anymore. But I didn't look at it that way at all. I always looked at it as there are other people out there who've experienced what I've experienced. And maybe in some way I can help them through empathy when I take reports and ways that I can do things to help their case get investigated properly and hopefully prosecuted.
Right.
So that's kind of what it all kind of boils down to and the big picture of things.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing that with me and our audience, and I'm as you're always so empathetic to others, I too feel that for you. That you had to go through those things and that what you have done in not even knowing as you entered the arena in law enforcement that you would become one of the most sought after experts about trauma and doing trauma informed interviews, and why that is such an incredible and important thing, because until our professionals are trained, we continue to see a big gap between detectives and law enforcement and those who have that trauma training or have had life experience, that instead of getting back at the world, they want to help others like you. There's a big gap between the trauma informed and those who are not. Um, how do you see where you went to, not even knowing this is where you were going?
That's an extremely important question for my life and for others who are doing what I did as investigators and police officers and first responders, even all the different various related disciplines that relate to victims and survivors, because that trauma informed and empathic approach is something that I was practicing before the terminology trauma informed even became a buzzword. And,
Right.
and I wasn't trauma informed then as I am now into the neuroscience, but being curious about that aspect of it was part of what led me to learn as much as I learned. And so after my experience as a detective and starting my own training and consulting business, and then the Army hearing about me and hiring me, put me in a situation where I was working with colleagues who were trauma informed in the neuroscience of trauma and memory. And that part of it intrigued me far more than I ever imagined that it would. But I was working with some extremely intelligent people who were deeply involved into the science, the neuroscience of the brain, and how the brain and the mind, the thinking part of your mind and the physical part of your brain and what it's wired and designed to do in fear and trauma situations was really what I was lacking in my trauma informed experience. So I knew to be empathic. I knew to ask open ended questions. I knew to be patient and to hear as much as a victim or survivor wanted to tell me. But I didn't understand why they were saying what they were saying and what their brain was doing, why some people were much more willing to talk about their trauma than others. And so I was learning from people like Dr. David Lesack and Dr. Jim Hopper and Dr. Kim Lonsway, who all have a very deep knowledge and understanding of the neuroscience of trauma and memory. And so when I started applying that and had the opportunity of also working with someone who took all of that and turned it into a matrix of asking questions in the right ways and the right time and how to listen. All of that combined put me in a situation where I was then training it not only to Army investigators, but investigators from all branches of the military. It was Department of Defense wide. all learning this technique. And I did have that wonderful opportunity of traveling to Europe and doing some of the training over there and in South Korea and all over the US. It was that base of knowledge that I also brought back and then combined it with what I was already doing and my contacts in the civilian world with law enforcement and sex assault nurse examiners and social workers, and really started expanding my work as a trainer consultant and still do that today. Yeah, it was an amazing journey.
Yes, what an amazing journey and what an amazing gift of bringing that light and understanding and knowledge so that we can do better. And if we can even train ourselves just with a few things that I've learned from you, just either listening to your podcast, Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, or in person when we've had moments to learn and to converse. And I've learned so much from just a few of the things to listen with empathy and not to interrupt someone, let them tell their story, to understand that memory and sexual trauma are one of the least understood parts of the neuroscience of the brain. And you also mentioned the brain, the part that just does what it does, where we fight, we fly away, we freeze, or we fawn. That's what the brain does to protect us in the moment of the trauma. But the thinking, the part that's your mind, is different than that part. And it's all neuroscience. You've taught me that one person will interpret something like a trauma immediately, whereas someone else may not. And so that was interesting about your mother and how the understanding of what had happened. And even though the body keeps the score, and there were things that were uncomfortable, maybe that you kind of alluded to, and other adult women, you don't really know. And how interesting that you had to go through all those things as an older person, the assaults that were more in your adult years, how it tied into your youth and what you had experienced also in your home. So my question to you is, can you tell us a little bit more so people understand that brain trauma connection, the memory and sexual trauma connection, why we don't remember certain things and why you can't do things chronologically with the interviewing process?
The thing to remember is that our brain, its main function, its main design is to keep us alive. That's the primary goal of the physical aspect of the brain. There's a portion of the brain deep inside the limbic system of the brain, which is just above your spinal cord, but in the center portion of the brain that's called the amygdala. And the amygdala is your fear center. That part of the brain is designed to be alert to danger and fear. And when it's activated, it becomes hyper aroused and it actually causes a cascade of hormone response chemicals and electrical impulses and vibrations in our brain that actually interfere with the cognitive part of our brain, our thinking brain. So the physical part of the brain takes over the mind, and the mind basically shuts down. We can't think clearly. We can't think into the future at all. We rarely think about consequences about what is going on, and we tend to dwell on the immediacy of the moment and what we need to do to survive. And you're right, it has to do with the freeze, fight, or flight aspect of what many of us are familiar with in trauma situations. But the first thing that always happens in all mammals in a fear or danger situation is to freeze. How long that freeze lasts depends upon a person's prior experiences with trauma. But usually speaking, that freeze moment isn't very long. It's an evaluation time for the brain to decide, what am I going to do? But in sexual assault, it tends to take longer or actually takes over what our response is. And about 40% of people who are being sexually assaulted or raped go into what's called tonic immobility, where that freeze lasts longer than just a few seconds. And oftentimes will go into minutes or even hours, where the body is rigid, isn't moving. There's a sensation of cold. You're thinking cognitively, but your brain isn't allowing the rest of your body to respond. So there's no screaming out. There's no fighting. There's no defense mechanism physically because we're frozen. And you'll hear that from sex assault victims all the time in the news, on TV, things like that. Well, What happened? Why didn't you fight back? You have long nails. Why didn't you use those fingernails to scratch, to gouge? Why didn't you bite? Why didn't you use the weapon for soldiers? Why didn't you use the weapon that you were right next to or even holding when this happened? And people will often say, I just froze. I didn't know what to do. And when people say, I just froze, it tends to make me think that they had gone into tonic immobility or something called collapsed mobility. Collapsed is different than tonic in that tonic, your body freezes up, and then collapsed is your body just becomes like a limp dish rag and you don't know what to do. And your body just becomes extremely pliable and you still can't react in a defense realm. And so to recognize that and to understand that is a huge part for people who haven't been in those situations to understand why victims and survivors do or did what they did because of the way the brain functions. And so tonic immobility is a big part of that. And even if they don't go into full tonic immobility, there can be elements of that as an impact of what the amygdala is doing. As far as remembering aspects of that, the chemicals that are dumped into the body at that point in time, those fear and danger situations, also interact with the hippocampus and the hypothalamus, which are right next to the amygdala. And the hypothalamus is very important in the formation of memory. And there's a chemical that all of us have in our brains called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. And you have to have BDNF in order to form a memory. But there are things that can interfere with BDNF. One of those things is alcohol, drugs, and then certainly fear and the chemicals that are dumped into the brain, like massive amounts of cortisol and adrenaline and epinephrine and all the other chemicals. There's hundreds of them. And all that can interfere with the brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And once that happens, you're not forming memories, or you're forming just little, what we call flashbulb moments of memory. And so there's these huge gaps where there is no memory. And people don't understand, how come I can remember this part of the assault, but not this part? And it has to do with the brain-derived neurotrophic factor and where it's being interrupted and when it's not, and how that all works together in strong impulse reactions and things that we're doing to try and save ourselves, because that's what our brain is designed to do. But another important thing to remember is that during all of that, the things that do go into memory are things that have to do with our senses: smells, sights, sounds, taste, touch. And then there's a sixth sense, even body positions, because our brains tend to remember that.
So, Dave, with all of that information, what comes up for me is, how in the world do we get that information to everyone who matters in saving the life of the child or the tween or the teenager or the young adult? Anybody who's sexually assaulted, it describes it so perfectly. And once I heard of those things and I learned about that a little more, and the things that you've taught me about it, it's scientific. It isn't just hoo-ha. This is the science of what happens in a sexual assault situation. And it would make all the difference in how we approach so many different angles with so many different professionals, but also us as friends, as family members of those who have gone through something. I know one of the best things would be book Dave Markel to come and do this very training. But for an individual that maybe just wants to know, what would you tell them to read? Is there articles or there books? What would you suggest that somebody wants to just become better informed?
There's a library full of books that if you just took the books on the neuroscience of trauma, there's hundreds of them out there. And the one that, of course, pops into mind is one you've just mentioned recently, and that is The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. It explains this so well, much better than I am in a layperson's terms. It's not all that easy to describe. But when you're talking about somebody who's a neuroscientist and an MD and a psychologist who wrote about it in really great detail, that book is probably one of the best. There's another one called Trauma and Memory by Dr. Peter Levine, which is also extremely enlightening and talks about this. If you were just to Google books on trauma memory and the impacts of trauma on the brain, the list is long of what would be available to you. But you're right, Jan. It's probably one of the biggest walls in trying to get this training out there is that there's so much pushback on all of this. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that people are already trained in a certain way, and their training was designed to not take in the neuroscience into consideration, but just the basics of what it means to investigate or to get information. And so much of the pushback I get is from law enforcement in the sense that what they're trained to do is ask questions in such a way that puts them in control of the interview so that they can control how long the interview lasts and what the content of that interview is. And it leaves aside the aspect of giving control to the victim or survivor that they're talking to and letting them tell the story in the way they want to tell the story. Start where they want to start, talk about what they're able to talk about, because in trauma, you're not always able to tell everything because so much of it is so impactful trauma wise that it interferes with our declarative memory and what we can tell in a narrative situation. So that's why you hear so many times cases get closed or not prosecuted because law enforcement or the prosecutor themselves will say, well, the story was inconsistent. The story didn't make sense. It wasn't put together well. And it made it sound like the person telling the story made things up or they were exaggerating certain parts of it and leaving other parts of it out. That's trauma. That's what
Yeah.
trauma does. And we have to be educated in that and learn how to ask the right questions in the right ways in order to get the whole story. That's the investigator's world of it. Get all that information and then investigate more based on what you've received in that interview and make some correlations and prove the veracity of the person who you just interviewed and the way they told their story with the sounds and sights and smells and tastes and the touches and the body positions. Go do whatever you need to do then to verify that information, put it into context. It's the investigator's job to put all those complex puzzle pieces together because the victim and survivor can only go so far into putting things together for us because their brain was in trauma and fear during the assault. And so much of that then doesn't sound reasonable, doesn't sound intuitive, doesn't sound like it makes any sense. And that's all because of what trauma does to the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the hippocampus, and the way our brains put things together. Another big issue for me is the fact that so many investigators want to interview sex assault and rape victims as soon after they get the report as possible. And if it's a sex assault or rape that has just happened, talking to the victim right after it just happened is not going to result in a very good interview. What that person needs is some time or that information in their brain, what just happened to them, their experience needs to be consolidated into a narrative form. And if you're trying to talk to you right after it happened, their brain hasn't had any time to evaluate, to assess, and to put into any sensical type of information or sentence structure that will help an investigator. And so oftentimes these cases are closed very early on. But in those instances too, where somebody may have waited 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years, 10 years before they even report that they were raped or sexually assaulted, then the immediate question for most law enforcement is, why'd you wait so long? Must not have been a very big deal. Must not have been very traumatic to you. Must not have been real. If it were real, you would have reported it right when it happened. And so there's all these counterintuitive thought processes going on in many people's minds. And I don't want to restrict it just to law enforcement. The same thing happens with victim advocates, and the same
Yep.
things happen with sex assault nurse examiners and mental health workers. If you're not familiar or aware or educated of what's going on in the brain during the trauma, then the aftermath of the trauma doesn't make much sense.
Okay, so you just said the buzzword. You said aftermath, and that's at the top of a page where I am putting in aftermath stories because I want to produce a series. I feel like Law& and Order SVU it has done the best job of any of the series that I've ever watched on television, on regular television, of bringing to light, saying the right words, and I've seen it evolve, for 25 years. I've been watching it for 25. This is its 25th season that we're going into. I have been watching that show almost religiously, and I've gone back and started over And I've been watching and the evolution of how that is. So for all intents and purposes, another show that I watched religiously was Oprah, and she was saying the words. She was saying truthful things that I had experienced. And I see this other television show that's evolved this way, and I titled my 25-year television show that I'm going to produce Aftermath. There's a lot of really good things that have happened on several shows. I watched a show called Broadchurch, and the first season especially was of such an impact to me in going, okay, that showed how grooming happens, and it's somebody that they knew and close to them, and you never, not even me, did I guess who the actual perpetrator was until it was revealed. And I was just like, no. But that is the part that now has to be told in the aftermath and maybe through flashback. So, would you come and be a consultant or be an actor if I get this produced? I'm going to do it.
You know I will. Anything that I could do to help you and to get that message out.
The story isn't over when the assault is over, it's only just begun. My
So
story has only been told to the age of 16, but all of it has focused on those years of that, and that which was really important, very much so. But now the rest of the story, like if I had 5 or 6 survivors who were these characters that know the aftermath and the specifics of their aftermath and how it relates back to the actual stories that we have, I think it would be incredible.
we've talked about this before. We've had small discussions about your desire to get a series like that going. In fact, I just met with Cooper this morning at favorite little restaurant spot.
Yeah. I'm supposed to meet with him tomorrow.
Yep, you mentioned that. He's fully on board with that. And for the audience, Cooper is a person who's been in the industry of television production and movies. He's also a former athlete, and he's got an amazing story, but he's also
An
a victim
Olympian, an
survivor,
Olympic athlete,
correct,
and a survivor. Yeah.
of sexual assault himself. And so he's got a lot of input on this. And what you're needing right away is some co-producers and writers that will help put this in perspective. And that's why I'm so willing to be a participant in that, is because I think the story needs to be told in the right way. You're right. The ripple effect and the aftermath is just as important in moving forward with investigation and possible prosecution as the event itself, because the event is the beginning of when that person's life was impacted and lasts forever. So,
Yes.
it's like asking you, what has happened in your personal life as a result of your rapes? And it could take forever to tell that story. It could take a series that would last for 25 years at
Yeah,
least.
absolutely, and there's so many stories that deal with those same things. There's so many people's stories that I know of that I now, because I've had so many people share their stories, and I have many that come in just in little short paragraphs. They want me to know, and I want them to know they're not alone and that they can get onto the healing path. But how does that look? And in different stories for different things, because even inside of sexual assault, you have rape, you have molestation, you have trafficking, you have exploitation, you have incest, you have all of these variants inside of it and all the aftermath for various people that have survived these things is different. And so if I could tell that story over 25 years of episodes like Law and Order SVU has done it to the point of, yeah, of interception, of sexual assault stories, sexual
Yeah.
victims unit, and then go beyond for the next part. That's what I would love to be doing for the rest of my life, and I plan to work until I'm 103.
I think that's a great goal. Work till you're 103.
Well, right. I mean, Jessica Tandy and some of my favorite actors, Betty White and some of these people, they, look at Murder, She Wrote. I love her.
Yeah.
I'm like, why not? And of course, I'm going to be the star of the show and going
Yeah.
to be able to do my acting thing that I love.
But we've even talked about this on
Yeah.
the last episode that I had you on as a guest, was the impact that even watching the 9 episodes of A Friend of the Family had on you after watching just the first 4 episodes in a
Right.
row,
Yeah.
and how just seeing it. I mean, you were a producer on the show. You were on set watching this stuff being filmed. You knew the scripts, but then to see it all put together and told as a story that was about you, it
Right.
really had another impact on your brain and your mind. And you
Yes.
had a pretty severe trauma reaction over the next 3 or 4 days after that.
Right.
So I think that's an important aspect of telling the story
Yeah.
is to talk about how the brain is impacted for the rest of your life. Even
Right.
people who've been through years and years of therapy may not have a complete understanding of why they do what they do and why these intrusive memories keep popping in, why they can't forget some things that they'd like to forget, and why they can't remember things that would help them put pieces together and tell their story in a more meaningful way. And that's just the way the brain works. That's the way things were recorded during the trauma episode. Telling that aftermath story is critically important. I like your idea.
Well, thanks, and I hope somebody else out there likes my idea and is ready to see it happen, because I do think that that is where we're at. We have a lot more knowledge, like, I hear young people, my niece and nephew and other young people that are talking words that I never knew when I was 17 but they know and diagnosing themselves. I think I have dissociative disorder, or I think because I was adopted and pretty much neglected as a baby, I might have, what they call attachment disorder. And I'm like, wow, I hear them talking about things that I'm like, okay, we've gotten to a place where young people, and we have social media, we have a way to get the information out. We're putting together a series of grooming videos to put out into the public eye to help from survivors who were groomed and what that looked like for them. And I think all of these things that we can do so that people can understand um, how it actually looks so that they aren't just dismissed and these cases can move forward is what's missing in this conversation. Because we're so tired of the sexual assault happening to children and young people and young adults. But how are we going to change it? I mean, how do we actually prevent it? First of all, we have to know it exists. We have to believe victims, and you're a big proponent of that.
Absolutely.
That's the first thing you say. Let's start by believing.
Yeah.
Believe the victim.
Yeah. I didn't come up with that. I didn't coin that term. It was actually initiated by Joanne Archambault from End Violence Against Women International back in the I think, early 90s, maybe late 80s. And it's been promulgated and pushed by the End Violence Against Women organization to the point where they now have active campaigns around the United States of start by believing and trying to get organizations and law enforcement and um, the lay people to understand what that means. It doesn't mean you have to discount the perpetrator's story and doesn't mean you have to just only believe the victim, but it has to do with how you interpret what you're going to do moving forward with the information that you're given. And especially in law enforcement, if somebody comes in to report that their car was stolen, the first suspect isn't the car owner. It's tell me more about where your car was left and how you left it and what happened. What was your experience with this? Not, well, it's probably you. But that's what we
Right.
do with assault cases and rape cases is how much had you been drinking? Why were you wearing what you were wearing? There's a lot of blame and disbelief when it comes to victims telling their stories. And if we start by believing, it changes our whole mindset. If we find out somewhere down the line that this is a false report or it was made up to some degree, so be it. But there's a reason for why a victim would make something like that up too. And we have to be empathic to that reason just as much as we are empathic to the reason that they're reporting that they truly were raped or sexually assaulted. So I think it's a critically important aspect is starting by believing because it just changes our initial thought process when we start hearing the story.
And it's really interesting that you compared that to somebody's car got stolen. They don't immediately go to the person and go, "Well, did you park in a really dark place? Oh my goodness. Well, did you
Leave the
leave the
doors
door
unlocked?
unlocked?"
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was
That
the
it
key in the ignition? Did you leave the fob
right.
in the car? Yeah.
Yeah,
That's generally not what's considered as the first place to start.
that's not investigation.
Right.
That's the blame and shame culture in the rape culture that we
Yep.
experience almost always. That the first thing is the victim, who normally would be asked all of these investigative types of questions so that they can go and check it out, is just put on trial. They literally feel as if they're put on trial. It's why so many times I have heard this over and over again. Well, what's the point of reporting it? Like there's this failure to protect program on our news. And it highlights all of the times and ways and places that someone reported, and yet they were not protected and the person was out, or, oh, there's not enough evidence or whatever. But it's like this person's been arrested like 7 times. You mean 7 different women? That doesn't mean something? It should mean something, but it should mean something when it's the first time. When
Yeah.
it's the first time that someone is disclosing. And you did an event for us in Thrivivors recently, and it was so great. It was called To Tell or Not to Tell, and you talked about disclosing and, being prepared for that experience, that it can be, and it has been for me and many others, a first step in our healing, or at least it's been somewhat empowering, but it also brings the backlash. Not being believed is a hugely, hugely distressing thing for a victim, and especially if you were a child or a teenager when you weren't believed then. Why would a kid make that up? And to
Yeah.
not be believed or to be blamed, those 2 things are just the worst thing you can do. That just shuts it down, and you don't trust you can tell anybody.
Right. And it's often referred to as re-traumatizing the victim or the survivor when you blame them or don't believe them. And in fact, there's research out there that shows that victims who aren't believed or who are blamed for their own crime have evaluated that response as being worse than the original rape. So it's re-traumatizing them, but the
Yeah,
re-traumatization can have a deeper, more scarring impact than just
right.
being in and of itself.
Okay. That makes
So
total sense to me. I mean, it absolutely does, because I have experienced it. And not that my parents didn't believe me when I told, but they believed I didn't tell all, and I didn't want to talk about all, and
wow.
they respected that, and they took responsibility, which was huge for me. But even so, I've had people in my adult life now, as I have shared my story, that have been, less than kind and empathetic, and certainly not believing. And it's hard, even at this age, even as it's still hard for me, even though I have learned how to let that roll off and just keep going. But that's hard, not to be believed or to be blamed or to be told you're stupid, you know? Really, really hard. So I am wondering about, kind of as we wrap up our conversation, which there's so many more things we could talk about.
Sure.
What did you suggest to our Thrivivors, or how did we talk about that, to tell or not to tell, for somebody that might be my age who's never told, and maybe there's no way they would go to law enforcement or try to do that route, but they just still are feeling like, maybe if I told, I could figure out some of these other problems that keep coming up in my life. Maybe there's something to that.
Well, I like to focus on the positives of telling. And when I say to tell or not to tell, as you just mentioned, telling doesn't necessarily mean you have to make a law enforcement report. Telling can just be telling someone you trust and feel safe with. And that's where the healing really starts. Because if we keep this inside, the negative, the downside, or one of the downsides of not telling has to do with just carrying that burden of being a victim, surviving something like that, the impacts that that has on our own lives. And if we're carrying it by ourselves, the impacts can be compounded and exacerbated by not telling. So we might face more somatic issues, bodily issues as a result of holding all of that in. More headaches, more stomach aches, more body aches, wherever, on top of the impacts emotionally of not being open with at least one person with what you're going through in your mind, those intrusive memories and those nightmares, and not understanding why you're feeling the way you're feeling and why the fear still exists. And what am I going to do if this ever happens again? When you get to the point where you finally feel like you can tell somebody, it can change your entire life. In fact, even if you're just telling a best friend or a loved one, regardless of whether you end up reporting to the police or not, telling seems to have a healing impact beyond just the immediate personal emotional aspect. So people who tell generally have better interpersonal relationships. They have better coping skills with how to handle day-to-day issues like finances, job, getting through the day. The flip side of that is that people who don't tell, and people who are afraid, or people who have told somebody and are not believed and are blamed, the impact is devastating. They don't make as much money in life. They don't have rewarding relationships. They don't have some of that same things that people who do tell experience. People who do tell have that added impact of knowing that they can find support, that there is healing available, and that they are making a difference in other people's lives who may not be ready to tell. So if you're telling, which is why I do the podcast that I do, it's not just for victims and survivors to tell their story, it's for everyone. Um, because we all know someone whose life has been impacted or affected by rape or sexual assault. If you're educated in that aspect and you know how to treat people with empathy and understanding and the compassion that's needed by that person in order for them to be fully functioning, there's more chance of a better response, like you're saying, in the public as a whole. So the impacts are far reaching and can be very, very helpful and helpful to a victim or survivor.
Yeah. Well, I really believe that. I I know that there's always that chance of it bringing up and whatever, and a lot of people just love to stuff things away and think that that will make it go away, but I mean, that's just like a sliver. It's just like this
Yep.
little tiny thing that I got in my foot the other day, and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, it is so small, I can't see it even with my glasses, but it hurts. It
Yeah.
hurts, and it will only get worse," and I finally had to go down with my mom, get her glasses on. She's like, "Oh, I think I can s" It was so funny, the 2 of us trying to even see the thing, and I'm like, "That's what this is." It just doesn't go away. You will have other experiences in life that you'll go, "Why do I act like this?" Or "Why can't I hold a job?" Or "Why am I going through another marriage and divorce?" Or "What is wrong with my what is this addiction thing that's gotten turned on in my life? Why am I cutting myself?" What You will find out that it leads to other things, other coping mechanisms that are unhealthy, that are
Right.
not the way to go. So,
Yep.
gosh, I appreciate that so much to say it in those ways. People, you can trust Dave Markel. you know, I may not be a professional, but I just know from my own experience that what he says is it's just so true. So, in our final couple minutes, Dave, I want to once again remind everybody about your podcast, Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, SASS. SASS. You can find Dave's podcast wherever you listen to podcasting. And I'm telling you, some of the stories are very incredibly impactful to be able to listen to other survivors. The things that we do, Dave, are meant to help those who maybe have not they're to help everybody, to help those that live with a survivor or that love a survivor, whether it's your child or your parent or your sibling or a friend, and also for yourself if you are a survivor, so that you
Yeah.
know you're not alone. And Dave has such a wonderful, of course, he's so talented at doing the interview process, so that's his expertise. He's going to be doing a roundtable for male survivors. We're going to do an episode for male survivors, and Dave's going to be on that roundtable. So look for that'll be coming up. We're going to try to do a roundtable, maybe once a month even is something that I would like to see us because there's so many different subjects that we could have and talk about. And I think there's something about having, 3 or 4 people around the conversation that's really makes it interesting. So Dave is going to lead that. How do you feel about that? Doing the round table with us?
I'm excited about it. I think it's absolutely necessary, and I am a big proponent of the fact that the more we talk about these issues, the better it is, even if it's hard to talk about, even if it does bring up some trauma-induced emotion. If we're telling that trauma-induced emotion in a environment that we feel safe and protected and believed in, that's a good thing. That's part of the healing process is exposing that trauma, exposing those fears, exposing the impacts that are in our lives, talking about them, facing them head on, and talking to others who've gone through some of the same exact things. That's why a roundtable is so important. So I'm honored that I was asked to host that roundtable, and
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it. It's gonna be great.
Yeah, it's gonna be great, and we've had some other, professionals that are therapists or, they do some kind of, male survivor groups, people that we've also, gotten to know, and we're gonna bring some of those people together and people that are doing great things, like you, Dave, who have survived also the same, who have gone through it personally or at least professionally, but most of our people that do events for us in Thrivivors, which is a very safe space because it is only for those who, um, you know, you can tell your story there, but it will never be shared unless you wanted to share it more publicly. It's only for that group and like your events, the things that are talked about with various survivors that are in our community. It's held in deep, it's a respected space and a safe space that won't be shared outside of that. But so many of these professionals that we've been able to interview, they've all had their own story, and that's why they're so good at really, talking through these things and helping all of us that are on that path and want to continue on that. If you were to give 1 or 2 tips, this is just a question like out of the blue. We talked about internet with my a couple of the stories that I have had on this show have dealt with how the crimes started with the internet. The perpetrators were there and then it some that were actually met up with and some that were, interrupted that they did not go meet up with that person that was going to traffic them. But the young person thinks, oh, good, somebody's paying attention to me. And is there anything that we can know from the detective, Dave, that would help us because it's become such a huge problem and such a huge issue.
I know this is controversial and very difficult to address because so many people are looking for a connection in their personal lives, and the internet is a vast pool of opportunity for a lot of people. At least that's the way they look at it. And I guess my admonition to anyone who's looking for a relationship online is to first be extremely wary and to start off the entire process of being suspicious of everyone until there is some way to verify that that person that you're having contact with is, number one, who they say they are, because there's so much out there in terms of artificial intelligence and fake voices and fake imagery, that it does present a gamut, a plethora of problems for anybody who's looking for relationships in that way. So I think that's the place to start. If you do get far enough down the road that you do want to go meet with somebody, I would definitely not go alone and be prepared, even in those circumstances, to be suspicious and wary of who it is that you're meeting and not kind of swallow their story hook, line, and sinker, but to be extremely cautious because there are so many perpetrators out there looking to take advantage of you in so many ways, maybe not just sexually and physically, personally, but they maybe have to
Financially.
steal your money, right?
Mhm.
And to fraud you into giving up certain information that could be extremely detrimental to you for the rest of your life. So
Yeah.
it's a very, very dangerous avenue to go down. And I know there are people who've gotten married because of people they've met on the internet. That happens and have endings that are happily ever after. But to get into that realm initially, I think the major thing I want to point out is to be weary and suspicious as you go into that situation, that anybody out there that you contact could be faking who they are and what they're doing.
Yeah, that's really good. That's great advice. And I know one of the saddest stories that I heard was of a young man who got, thought he was in a relationship and sent, pictures of, his body and body parts, and then was, had been groomed into this relationship and into sextortion, and ended up, instead of being able to pay $100 is what they asked for to not show the pictures online. He took his own life. And this was, a young man from a really good family that, you know, there was love there and compassion and trust. And yet I know how, if you are groomed in the right way at the right age, which we didn't talk about, that was one of the things I want to talk about in a future conversation about the age appropriate understanding of a victim, because that also is incredibly important, where their brain development is, where their mind and their thinking is at age 4 and 14 and 24 and 34 and 44 is different, especially in those young ages. Anyway, we didn't get to talk about that. There's another, so that's one of those stories that I just has stuck with me. And another one that some friends of ours, Ken and Liz, sent us a story that we didn't get to talk about, of a father who actually killed his son's abuser. And the son was 11 when it happened. And the son, in this article that we were sent, he said, I wanted it to stop, but I didn't want my dad to kill him, and how it has affected his whole life as a secondary trauma, the trauma of being abused and the trauma of that happening, and how often people say, oh, I would just kill the guy, or I would just do this or that. And we were going to talk about how often that is such an ignorant response in comparison to the full picture of what that effect would have. And it's the same kind of thing when you're not believed. It's such an ignorant response.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Devastating to not be
we
believed.
yeah, it is. So anyway, there's other things left unsaid that we did not talk about that I would like to talk about at a future time. Um, if anyone listening out there thinks that, Dave and his consulting services would help, your business, because there's a lot more of this going on now with corporations and businesses who are realizing the need for informed um, information that really informs their employees, the administration, how their human services departments interact with. There's a lot needed. And so if you need Dave's consulting services, please visit his website, which is markelconsulting.com, and or reach out. Dave, you have another way that you want people to reach out? Is this the best way?
Well, the website is a great way. As Jan just said, it's markel-consulting.com. But I do this all the time. I'm maybe naive to some degree in doing this, but I give out my email address on my show frequently and ask people if they're wanting to tell their story and want to talk to me about that possibility to just contact me. But the same goes for what you just said. If you're looking for more information on hiring me or bringing me in to train employees, administrators, anybody on how to be better listeners and interviewers and how to communicate in a much more fruitive way, just reach out to me at Dave Markel, run that all together, DaveMarkel @gmail.com.
I give out my email too, Dave. So I think maybe we're both just such positive thinkers that we too are, I don't know if we're naive. I just think that we know the risks, but we also know the impact. And you
Right.
have made a huge impact.
I've had lots of really wonderful experiences of people reaching out to not only compliment the podcast and tell how that podcast has changed their own life, but also in ways of communicating to me other potential guests that I could invite to be on the show. I just love having that open communication with my listeners. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you.
Okay. Thank you, Dave, so much for this. And one more time, his podcast is S.A.S.S. So SAS with 2 S's, Sex Assault Survivor Stories. And thank you, Dave, for being our guest and for all that you do to move our rape culture into a better kind of culture, as we talked about in one of our past podcasts, what a rape culture is and why we live in one, how these issues are what keep us in a rape culture until this is all brought to light. We have to bring it to light, and that's what we're trying to do. Thank you so much for being here.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. My deepest and heartfelt appreciation goes out to Jan Broberg and her entire production team for producing this episode of The Jan Broberg Show and granting me the privilege of airing it on my show. This has truly been an honor. I hope all of you listening gained some powerful insights on how to be trauma-informed and how you can use this influential knowledge to start by believing in helping bring justice to victims and survivors. Because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. Thank you for joining me, and please tune in next week for another incredible episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. We'll see you next week.